Before hundreds of agents, my father, the director of the FBI, ripped the badge from my chest. His voice was a hiss, meant only for me. "I wish you had never been my daughter." Then he turned, roaring to the crowd, "This woman is a disgrace, a traitor to national security." My name is Raissa Boone, a 33-year-old senior agent in the FBI's elite Janus Initiative. I once believed loyalty was the ultimate shield, a virtue instilled in me by my own father, Director Theron Vance. Standing before him and hundreds of peers that day, I expected a commendation for a successful mission, not a lesson in how the people who build you know exactly how to tear you down. As he approached the podium, I held my breath, waiting for a single nod of approval I'd craved my entire life. Instead, his voice boomed, cold and terrifyingly unfamiliar. Betrayal comes not from our enemies, but from within. His eyes locked onto mine as he delivered the gut punch. "This woman," he roared to the silent, stunned crowd, "is a traitor to national security." I felt the blood drain from my face, my entire world shattering in that single brutal moment. Have you ever been publicly destroyed by the one person sworn to protect you? If you understand the sting of that kind of betrayal, leave a comment below just to let me know you're here. They thought this was the end of my story. It wasn't. It was the beginning of a war they never saw coming. Follow to witness how I fight back. The silence that followed his accusation was a physical thing. It pressed in on me, sucking the air from the David Attenborough auditorium. The familiar, institutional scent of stale coffee and polished wood suddenly felt suffocating. Just moments before, I had stood at that same podium, my perfectly tailored pantsuit feeling like armor, as I delivered a flawless report on a successful counter-espionage campaign. I had felt the weight of hundreds of eyes on me then, a mixture of respect and professional curiosity. Now that collective gaze had curdled into something else entirely. My father, Director Theron Vance, stood there, his face a mask of cold fury I had never seen directed at me. The air, once buzzing with post-briefing murmurs, grew thick and heavy. I could feel the shift ripple through the room as hundreds of my colleagues, my peers, turned their heads from him to me. Tense curiosity morphed into horrified disbelief. I watched faces I'd known for years, agents I'd shared stakeouts with in freezing cars, analysts I'd debated with over late-night takeout, become stony, unreadable masks. The blood rushed from my head, leaving a hollow, ringing sound in my ears, but I didn't flinch. I stood straight, my shoulders back, my chin up. It was a reflex, a posture of discipline he himself had drilled into me since I was a child. Don't show weakness. Never let them see you break. Then he moved. He descended the steps from the stage, his heavy, polished dress shoes making no sound on the thick carpet. Yet each step landed like a hammer blow in the dead quiet. He walked directly toward me, a predator closing in. The sea of dark suits parted for him, a silent, unwilling honor guard to my execution. He stopped just inches from me, so close I could see the tiny, broken capillaries in his ice-blue eyes. The space between us felt like a chasm, a canyon carved out in the space of 30 seconds. He didn't raise his hand to strike me. He did something far worse. His hand shot out, fast and vicious, and his fingers clamped around the FBI shield pinned to the lapel of my jacket. There was a sharp, sickening sound, the sound of sturdy fabric being violently torn, that echoed in the tomb-like silence. He ripped my identity from my chest. Then he leaned in, his face a contorted mask of rage, and he delivered the final fatal blow. His voice was a low, venomous hiss, a curse meant only for me. I wish you had never been my daughter. It wasn't the voice of a director. It was the voice of a father disowning his child, erasing her from existence. The words struck me with the force of a physical impact. And in that instant, my carefully constructed world, my entire sense of self, shattered into a million pieces of glittering dust. Before I could even process the raw primal pain of it, he straightened up, turned his back on me, and roared to the crowd, his voice once again the booming instrument of command. This woman is a disgrace, a traitor to national security. The spell was broken. 2 security agents, men I'd known since Quantico, moved toward me. Their familiar faces were now alien, their eyes filled with a guarded wariness that hurt more than any accusation. I didn't resist. I couldn't. I was a statue of silent collapse, my feet rooted to the floor. As their hands were about to touch my arms, a voice cut through the tension, sharp and full of authority. "Stop!" Deputy Director Evelyn Reed emerged from the front row, moving with a politician's smooth, calculated grace. She fixed Director Vance with a hard stare, then swept her gaze over the stunned audience. "This will be handled by the book," she announced, her tone leaving no room for argument. "Not by a public trial." She walked directly to me, her expression a mask of controlled sympathy. With a gesture that seemed both protective and proprietary, she slipped her own expensive wool coat over my shoulders, covering the torn fabric on my suit. She leaned in close, her voice a low, reassuring whisper against my ear. "Come with me," she murmured. "I'll protect you." For me, in that maelstrom of betrayal and shock, her words were a lifeline. I clung to them, allowing her to steer me away from the prying eyes, away from the man who had just destroyed me. I had no way of knowing I had just been rescued by the shark, and she was leading me into much deeper, darker waters. The warmth of Evelyn Reed's coat was a lie. The moment the heavy steel door of the security room clicked shut behind me, the borrowed comfort vanished, leaving me in a sterile white box that was colder than any winter night. The shock that had shattered my world in the auditorium had receded, leaving behind a hollow, ringing numbness. I was no longer an agent, no longer a daughter. I was a specimen in a jar, placed here for observation by my supposed protector. The low, monotonous hum of the ventilation system was the only sound, a constant drone that seemed to amplify the silence in my head. And in that silence, the ghosts of the past began to speak. My mind drifted back to a sweltering June day in Quantico, Virginia. The air on the graduation field was thick with the smell of cut grass and the joyful shouts of families. I stood at the top of my class, the salutatorian, my uniform crisp, my posture perfect. But as I scanned the sea of proud, smiling faces, one was conspicuously absent. My father wasn't there. He was a world away, his voice tinny and rushed over a satellite phone from some forgotten outpost in the Middle East. "Good work, Boone," he'd said, the connection crackling. "Now the real work begins." There was no "Congratulations, honey," no "I'm proud of you, sweetheart," just Boone. The same last name he gave to every agent under his command. I was an asset, a high-performing subordinate who had met expectations. I stood alone on that field, watching other fathers wrap their daughters in fierce, proud hugs, lifting them off the ground in celebration. I watched them and felt nothing, a profound, aching emptiness. I had become invisible in the one place I was supposed to be seen. That specific pain, the quiet agony of being overlooked at the peak of my achievement, became the first brick in the fortress I built around my heart. It was a necessary defense, a wall to keep the cold out or so I told myself. But walls, I would learn, also keep everything else out too. The hum of the air conditioner in the security room seemed to shift, and another memory surfaced, this one from a bitter winter evening in Washington, D.C. I was in a small, dark-paneled bar off Pennsylvania Avenue, the kind of place where secrets were currency and no one asked your name. I had just been officially inducted into the Janus Initiative, an honor that felt as much like a curse as a blessing. It meant a life in the shadows, a commitment so absolute it erased everything else. I had told my father earlier that day. He'd simply nodded, a curt, dismissive gesture that said, this was the expected trajectory. It was just another step in the career path he had laid out for me. There was no acknowledgement of the sacrifice, of the life I was giving up. But that night, Julian Croft, the legal counsel for Janus, sat across from me in the booth. Julian was a quiet man, with eyes that saw more than he ever spoke of. He didn't offer congratulations or platitudes. He just listened as I spoke, then slid a small, worn, leather-bound book across the sticky table. It was a copy of Meditations by Marcus Aurelius. For the long nights ahead, he said, his voice low. It was such a simple gesture, yet it struck me with the force of a revelation. For the first time, someone had acknowledged the burden, not just the glory. Someone saw the weight I was about to carry, the solitude that would become my constant companion. My father saw a tool being sharpened for his arsenal. Julian saw a human being stepping into the darkness. That book became my silent confidant, a tangible reminder tucked away in my go-bag that someone, somewhere, had once truly seen me. Not Nix, the operative, not Boone, the agent, but Raisa. Back in the cold, white present, the drone of the vent was a steady, maddening pulse. I stared at the one-way security glass, seeing only a faint, distorted reflection of myself, a ghost in a white room, and in that moment, the map of my life laid itself bare. The cruelty my father had shown me today wasn't a sudden storm. It was the hurricane that had been gathering force for 33 years. Every ignored achievement, every moment of withheld affection, every time I was treated as a project instead of a person, it was all a prelude to this. He had forged me into a weapon of logic and justice, taught me to hunt monsters, but had never once shown me the love a daughter deserves from her father. The searing pain in my chest from his words began to cool, to change its state. It was no longer a hot, liquid agony. It was hardening, compressing under the immense pressure of a lifetime of hurts, crystallizing into something new, something cold, sharp, and unbreakable. A diamond of pure, cold rage taking shape in my soul. I looked at the pale, blurry woman staring back at me from the glass. Her face was a mask of exhaustion, but her eyes held a new, dangerous light. You wrote your story, I whispered to the reflection, my voice raspy, unfamiliar. You wrote me as a villain, a footnote in your legacy. I pushed myself to my feet, the strength returning to my limbs, fueled by this newfound icy resolve. This wasn't about revenge. Revenge was a hot, messy emotion. This was about justice. This was about truth. Now, I promised the woman in the glass, I write mine. The diamond of rage in my soul was a cold comfort, but it was also a lens. It sharpened the world, burning away the fog of grief and shock, leaving only the hard, tactical realities of my situation. I was a prisoner. My name was being destroyed in the world outside, and my warden, my supposed savior, was a woman whose motives were as opaque as the one-way glass on the door. Hours later, Evelyn Reed returned. She carried a standard-issue FBI cafeteria tray the kind that smelled faintly of industrial dish soap. On it sat a Salisbury steak swimming in a glossy brown gravy, a scoop of instant mashed potatoes, and a pile of sad, overcooked green beans from a can. It was a meal of profound indifference, a corporate gesture masquerading as care. "You need to eat, Raisa. Keep your strength up," she said, her voice dripping with the same practiced sympathy she'd used in the auditorium. She slid the tray onto the small metal table. I picked up the fork, the plastic flimsy in my hand, and took a bite. It was tasteless, textureless. As I chewed, Reed sat across from me, her posture relaxed, but her eyes were sharp, analytical. The debrief began, disguised as a friendly chat. "The hostiles in that last operation," she started, her tone casual. "The ones who got away. Was there anything unusual about their communications? Anything that felt off?" I kept my expression neutral, feeding her sanitized by-the-book answers. But with every question, a new layer of her agenda was revealed. She wasn't asking about my well-being. She was mining me for intelligence. Her questions were too precise, too surgically aimed at the weak points of my last mission. She knew exactly what to ask, what gaps to probe. A red flag, bright and crimson, went up in my mind. This wasn't comfort. This was an interrogation. Evelyn Reed wasn't protecting a fallen agent. She was stripping an asset for parts. She finally left, leaving me alone with the half-eaten, pathetic meal. The silence returned, but now it was charged with suspicion. I was in a cage, and the zookeeper was testing the locks. I felt a surge of frustration, of helplessness. I was a master of strategy, a ghost who could move through the world unseen, and I was trapped in a white room, my fate in the hands of a political operator. The walls felt like they were closing in. My mind flashed to the worn, leather-bound copy of Meditations, to Julian, and to the passage he had underlined for me all those years ago. The impediment to action advances action. What stands in the way becomes the way. The words echoed in my head, a quiet stoic philosophy cutting through my anger. The obstacle is the path, this room, this prison. This was my new arena. My isolation was a weapon, if I chose to see it that way. It gave me time to think, to analyze, to plan. Reed thought she had me contained, but she had only given me a command center. The rage in my chest cooled further, solidifying into pure strategic focus. That focus was tested in the dead of night. I was jolted from a light, restless sleep, not by a noise, but by the sudden absence of it. The constant low hum of the ventilation system had ceased. A heartbeat later, the red emergency strobes on the ceiling began to flash, painting the white room in silent, pulsing waves of crimson light. But there was no alarm, no siren, a silent drill. My training kicked in before my mind had time to process fear. This was a test, a psychological probe, or a threat. Instead of panicking, Nyx took over. In the disorienting, flashing darkness, I moved with fluid efficiency. I rolled the thin blanket from the cot and jammed it into the crack under the door to block any potential gas. I soaked a small hand towel in the water from the toilet, preparing a crude filter. My eyes scanned the room, locating the 2 pinhole cameras I had already identified, making sure my movements were deliberate, controlled. I was a creature of the shadows, and for those few minutes, the darkness was my ally. Then, as suddenly as it had stopped, the ventilation kicked back on with a low rumble, and the strobes went dark. The room was plunged back into a flat, sterile white. The test was over. The next morning, Reed visited, her face a mask of deep concern. "I heard there was an incident last night," she said. her eyes searching mine for any sign of fear or weakness. "Are you all right?" I looked directly at her, my own face a placid mask. "Perfectly fine, Director," I said, my voice even. "Just a system glitch, I assume." Her eyes held mine for a second too long. In that moment, I knew with absolute certainty she was behind it. She was testing my limits, gauging my response, trying to see if I would break. I now understood the board completely. I was a pawn in a game I didn't yet understand, trapped in a cage built by the woman pretending to be my savior. And pawns, if they stay pawns, are always sacrificed. I couldn't fight this war alone. I needed an ally. Someone who knew the Bureau's labyrinthine systems, who understood the shadow world of Janus. Someone I could trust without question. There was only one name. I waited for her to finish her performance of concern. Then I looked her straight in the eye, my voice no longer that of a victim, but of an agent stating her terms. "I need to see Julian Croft," I said. It wasn't a request, it was a condition. He was the former legal counsel for Janus. He's the only one who can help me prove my innocence. A flicker of surprise crossed Reed's face, quickly suppressed. She hadn't expected a demand. She had expected a broken woman. After a long, calculating pause, she gave a slow, deliberate nod. "Very well," she conceded, her voice tight. "But the meeting will take place here, under my supervision." "Fine," I replied, my heart hammering against my ribs. The first move on the board was mine. The game had begun. When they brought Julian Croft in, a wave of relief so potent it almost buckled. My knees washed over me. He looked older, the salt in his salt and pepper hair having gained significant ground since I'd last seen him. But the sharp, intelligent light in his eyes was unchanged. He was the calm center of any storm. But my relief was short-lived, strangled by the cold reality of the room. We weren't allowed a private meeting. He was led into an adjacent chamber, and the only thing connecting us was a thick, multi-layered sheet of security glass. He was a visitor at a maximum security prison, and I was the inmate. Evelyn Reed's disembodied voice crackled through a speaker mounted on the wall. "Julian, Ms. Boone has requested your counsel. For transparency, this entire session will be recorded and logged." Julian's gaze flickered from me to the small, dark dome of the camera on the ceiling, a look of profound disgust tightening his jaw. He didn't waste a single word acknowledging Reed. Instead, he walked to the glass and placed his palm flat against it. My heart leaped. Without hesitation, I mirrored the gesture, my own palm meeting his, through the cold, unyielding barrier. It was an old, unspoken signal from the early days of the Janus Initiative, a silent pact between operatives. The walls have ears, trust your gut. In that single silent moment, our alliance was reforged, a secret handshake performed in plain sight of the enemy. We were a team again. The chess match began. "All right, Raisa," Julian started, his voice the dry, uninspired monotone of a lawyer going through the motions. He began spouting procedural nonsense, citing obscure federal regulations and evidence-handling protocols. A verbal smokescreen of legalese designed to bore our observer into complacency. Pursuant to Title 28, Section 0.85, we need to review all evidentiary chains of custody, specifically those pertaining to your recent casework. But woven into the jargon was a second hidden language, our language. "I think we should start by revisiting the Nightingale case file," he said, his eyes fixed on mine. Nightingale, a deep cover operation from 5 years ago that had exposed an illegal wiretapping ring. His meaning was clear. We are being listened to. Everything is compromised. And within that file, he continued, shuffling papers he'd brought with him, I'd pay special attention to evidence receipt 404. Receipt 404. In Bureau IT speak, a 404 error means not found. He was telling me something had been deleted. Something was missing from the official record. I understood instantly. I had to look for the holes, the gaps in the data, the digital ghosts. I played my own move. Of course, Julian, but we'll need to cross-reference that with the intake logs from the Cerberus vault, I replied, my voice just as flat. Cerberus, the codename for the FBI's most secure, triple-redundant evidence repository. I was telling him the missing data was high-level, and its disappearance was intentional. Our conversation was a masterpiece of misdirection, a ballet of coded words performed for an audience of one. To Reed, we were two professionals discussing legal strategy. To us, we were mapping out a battlefield, identifying targets, and planning a counterattack, all through the impenetrable shield of shared history. Based on Julian's counsel, I said, turning my head to address the camera, as if I were speaking to Reed, I need to see the full access logs for the Cerberus vault for the last 48 hours. Every entry, every exit, every query. There was a pause. Reed, wanting to maintain her facade of a helpful collaborator, finally responded, her voice smooth as silk over the speaker. A reasonable request. I'll have the data streamed to your terminal. A few moments later, lines of green text began scrolling down the monitor in my room. It was a fire hose of raw data, thousands of entries, indecipherable to the untrained eye. But my eyes were trained for this. I scanned the timestamps, the agent ID numbers, the authorization codes, and then I saw it, a single line of code that screamed like a siren. At Ijogu 2:17 a.m., the access card belonging to SAIC Kaylin Thorne, Special Agent in Charge Kaylin Thorne, was logged scanning into the west entrance of a secure 100-meter-long data corridor. At that exact same second, 02:17 now, his card was also logged scanning out at the east entrance. It was physically impossible. Not even an Olympic sprinter could cover that distance in less than a second. Looks like a system glitch, Reed's voice commented from the speaker, laced with a casual, dismissive tone. I'll have a T look into it. But I knew it wasn't a glitch. A system glitch is random. This was precise. This was a signature. It was the unmistakable digital footprint of a cloned keycard. A ghost in the machine used to create a fraudulent alibi. It was the first thread of the web that had been woven to entrap me. Someone had framed me, and they had used Kaylin Thorne's credentials to do it. Or Thorne himself was the spider at the center of it all. I looked up from the screen, my eyes meeting Julian's through the glass. I gave him the slightest, almost imperceptible nod. He nodded back, his expression grim but resolute. Reed could listen all she wanted. She could watch our every move, but she couldn't see the silent message that passed between us in that moment. The hunt had begun. The hunt was on. With the discovery of Thorne's cloned keycard, we had our first solid thread. But a conspiracy this sophisticated, this deeply embedded within the Bureau's infrastructure, wouldn't rely on simple messages. It would need its own private, untouchable record. And Janus had built just the thing for a situation like this. From my terminal, I watched as Julian, working under the guise of reviewing standard case files with Reed's permission, executed a series of complex keystrokes. It was a sequence I knew by heart, a digital incantation to open a door that officially didn't exist. On his screen, the familiar blue and white interface of the FBI's mainframe dissolved. replaced by a stark black screen with cascading lines of glowing green code. He had accessed the shadow ledger. It was Janus's greatest secret, a completely independent, parallel record-keeping system built on a rudimentary form of blockchain technology. Every action, every report, every suspicion logged by a Janus agent was recorded immutably. It couldn't be altered, couldn't be deleted, not even by the director himself. It was a weapon of absolute truth in a world of shadows and lies, and Reed had no idea it was there. Searching for keyword Thorn, Julian's voice came through my earpiece. A separate, secure channel we had established. The system cross-referenced decades of data. A moment later, a file appeared. It was an old case note I had written myself years ago during an operation in Baltimore. I remembered the case vividly. Something had felt wrong. Julian read my own words back to me. Subject Sake Kaylin Thorne. Evidence handling is flawless. All protocols followed to the letter. He paused. Note concludes, Thorne is too clean, suspiciously clean. A cold chill went down my spine. My gut had been screaming at me back then, and I had logged it in the one place I knew it couldn't be erased. Thorne had been on my radar for years. Just as we were about to dig deeper, the door to my room opened. A junior agent, looking nervous, addressed the camera on the wall. "Director Reed, ma'am, something's happening. It's all over the news." Reed's voice crackled over the intercom, sharp and annoyed. "Put it on her monitor." The data stream from Julian vanished, replaced by the live feed of a major 24-hour news network. And there was my face, a stern-looking official photo, plastered across the screen. The Chiron at the bottom of the screen screamed in bold yellow letters, "FBI in crisis, legendary agent N. Wawex. Accused of treason." My blood ran cold. A so-called national security correspondent was speaking gravely, his voice filled with manufactured authority. Sources high within the Bureau describe a rogue agent, a fallen hero who used her unparalleled skills and access to sell state secrets. The narrative was the same across every channel, quoting the same anonymous senior officials. It was a coordinated character assassination, a blitzkrieg aimed at destroying me beyond repair. They weren't just trying to frame me within the FBI, they were burying me in the court of public opinion. A wave of pure, helpless rage washed over me. I was trapped, forced to watch as they murdered my name, and I couldn't do a single thing. My hands clenched into fists, my nails digging into my palms. "Raisa, breathe." Julian's voice cut through the noise in my ear, calm and steady. "This is part of their plan. Don't let it work. Ignore the noise. Focus on the data. The truth is in the machine, not on the screen." He was right. I took a deep, shuddering breath, forcing the rage down, channeling it. I turned away from the television and focused back on the terminal as Julian brought the data back up. The world could scream all it wanted. The only thing that mattered was finding the proof. And then we found it, a torrent of it. We discovered that the key surveillance video that supposedly placed me at an illegal data drop was a sophisticated deepfake. Its encryption signature didn't match the standard algorithm used by the Bureau's cameras. It was a forgery. Next, we found logs showing my credentials, accessing a classified server while it was under a physical evidence seal. Cross-referencing maintenance photos, we saw the seal had microscopic scoring around the edges. It had been carefully removed with a precision laser and then reapplied. The pieces were falling into place, painting a picture of an incredibly sophisticated frame job. But the final piece of the puzzle was the one that broke me. Julian uncovered a high-priority system override request, authorizing the emergency deletion of security logs from the night of the alleged breach. It was the digital smoking gun. The request had been submitted by Kaylin Thorne, and it had been approved, fast-tracked, and pushed through with the digital signature of the one man with the authority to do it, Director Theron Vance, my father. The name glowed on the screen, a final damning piece of evidence. I stared at it, the air leaving my lungs in a silent rush. The document had been buried in a thick stack of routine daily briefings, a classic bureaucratic sleight of hand. He wouldn't have even known what he was signing. My father, I whispered, the words catching in my throat, the cold diamond of rage in my chest cracking under a fresh wave of pain. He signed it without reading. The revelation that my father's signature had sealed my fate was a new kind of agony. It wasn't the sharp, clean cut of betrayal I'd felt in the auditorium. It was a dull, crushing weight. He hadn't done it out of malice, but out of negligence, and somehow that felt worse. He hadn't even seen me enough to know he was destroying me. As Julian and I sat in stunned silence, the enemy made their next, most vicious move. The news feed on my monitor, which had been cycling through the same talking heads, suddenly cut to a breaking news banner. The screen filled with grainy, chaotic footage from what looked like a handheld camera. The location stamp read, Arlington, Virginia. My breath caught in my throat. I recognized the building. It was a low-profile FBI safe house, a place for debriefings and witness protection. The camera zoomed in on a figure moving in the shadows near a side entrance. A woman with my build, my hair, my movements, a perfect digital doppelganger. She knelt, placing a small, dark object against the foundation of the building. My face, flawlessly rendered by a deepfake algorithm, glanced up at the camera for a split second. Then she melted back into the night. Seconds later, the screen flashed white. A violent explosion ripped through the side of the building, sending a plume of fire and debris into the night sky. The news anchor's voice returned, grave and somber. This shocking footage appears to show the moments before the fatal explosion at an FBI facility in Arlington, an attack which sources now confirm has claimed the lives of 3 young agents. The screen split, showing my official FBI photo next to the smiling, hopeful faces of the 3 agents who had been killed. I knew them. I had mentored one of them. Bile rose in my throat. This was a new level of depravity. They hadn't just framed me for treason. They had branded me a murderer, a killer of my own colleagues. A guttural sound of pure rage escaped my lips. I slammed my fist against the unyielding security glass, a crack of sound in the sterile room. It was a rare, raw loss of control. The cold diamond of anger in my chest exploded into a supernova of revulsion and fury. The final pieces of the trap began to snap shut. On the secure line, I could hear Reed's end of a frantic phone call. It was my father's voice, ragged with a mixture of fury and anguish, roaring with such force that I could hear it clearly. "You can't protect a monster anymore, Evelyn. She's killed our own. I want her transferred to the internal disciplinary board. Now." Reed, ever the performer, played her part. "Theron, calm down," she said, her voice a placating balm. "We need concrete evidence, not a trial by television. Let me handle this." But I knew it was over. His demand was a death sentence. The disciplinary board was a black hole. Once they had me, I would disappear into the Bureau's deepest, darkest dungeons, and the truth would die with me. The walls were no longer closing in. They were crushing me. In that moment of absolute despair, a memory surfaced. A voice from the past, my father's ironically. We were on a training course years ago, and he was teaching me tactical strategy. "When you're cornered, Boone," he had said, his voice sharp and clear, "don't fortify. You demolish the wall behind you and create a new exit." His own words were my salvation. I couldn't defend. I had to attack. I had to create my own exit. Have you ever been pushed so far into a corner that the only way out was to break all the rules? Tell me in the comments if you know that feeling. I stood up and walked directly to the camera, my reflection a pale, determined ghost in the lens. I spoke, not to the camera, but directly to the woman on the other side. "Read," I said, my voice devoid of any emotion but a chilling, steely calm. "You and I both know I didn't do this, but I can't prove it from inside this cage." I took a deep breath, letting the air fill my lungs, fueling the fire that had replaced my fear. I need to disappear, on my own terms. The people who made that video, the people who murdered those agents, they used real infrastructure, a server farm, a rendering room, a point of origin. I will find it. I pressed my palm flat against the cold glass, just as I had with Julian, but this was no alliance. This was an ultimatum. "Give me 12 hours, I said, my voice dropping to a low, dangerous promise. "That's all I need. If you don't, if you hand me over, our common enemy wins. Your rival, Thorn, will consolidate his power, and you will have lost your only weapon against him. But if you give me a window, I will burn their entire network to the ground." I stared into the lens, letting her see the truth of my conviction. In my eyes, she would no longer see a victim. She would see Nix, the operative she'd only ever heard stories about, fully awake and ready for war. "And I swear to you, Evelyn," I finished, "I will not die in silence." My ultimatum hung in the air, a gamble played in a room with no windows. For a long, agonizing moment, the only sound was the low hum of the server fans. I watched the unblinking red light of the camera, trying to read the mind of the woman on the other side. Evelyn Reed was a master chess player. Would she sacrifice her pawn to protect the board, or would she unleash it to take out a rival piece? The speaker on the wall remained silent, but then a soft chime sounded from the terminal on my desk. A new message, delivered through the secure channel Julian and I had used, appeared on the screen. It was from an anonymous source. It wasn't a message, it was a blueprint. Northwest corner ventilation shaft. Maintenance access panel. Routine system check scheduled in 10 minutes. You have a 5-minute window. It was followed by a single line of text. Make it count. Reed had made her move. She hadn't helped me out of compassion. She was a pragmatist. Thorn had become a liability, a rabid dog on a chain that was getting too long. She was unleashing me, her own personal attack dog, to put him down. She was using me as the ultimate weapon, and she was giving me the key to my own cage. I didn't waste a second. The clock was ticking. I snapped the thin metal frame of my reading glasses at the joint. The arm became a crude but effective screwdriver. The screws on the ventilation grill were standard issue, and they gave way with a soft groan. I slid the grill open. The air that wafted out was cool and smelled of dust and ozone. Slipping into the duct was a tight squeeze. It was a world away from the polished, climate-controlled offices of the J. Edgar Hoover building. Here, in the guts of the machine, it was dark, cramped, and dirty. This was my element. The skills of a Janesfield operative, dormant for so long, surged back to life. I moved through the narrow, branching tunnels, my body contorting to fit the space. My mind was a map of the building's schematics, my internal clock counting down the seconds. I calculated the patrol routes of the security teams in the corridors below, their footsteps echoing faintly through the metal. I held my breath, slowing my heart rate, making my thermal signature almost invisible as I crawled over the heat sensors I knew were placed at key junctions. I was a ghost in the machine, a phantom moving through the arteries of the very system that had created and then disowned me. The irony was a bitter taste in my mouth. I had once walked these halls as a legend. Now I was crawling through them like a rat. My destination was the central data vault, the heavily fortified heart of the Bureau's digital empire. I had only minutes before the system check would begin and my window would slam shut. I dropped down from a service hatch into a darkened utility closet. The silence of the server room beyond the door a low, powerful hum. I bypassed the lock and slipped inside. Rows upon rows of black server towers stood like monoliths in the cold, conditioned air, their blinking green and amber lights the only illumination. This was the dark heart of the conspiracy. I jacked directly into a terminal, my fingers flying across the keyboard, executing a series of backdoor commands. Julian and I had designed years ago for emergencies like this. I wasn't searching for my own name. That was a fool's errand. They would have buried any evidence against me under layers of digital concrete. I was hunting the hunter. I searched for one name, Kaylin Thorne. The system fought back, but I was relentless. I bypassed firewalls, broke through encryption, and finally I hit the motherlode. A project file, encrypted at the highest level, a digital fortress sealed with every security measure the Bureau possessed. Its name sent a shiver down my spine. Project Manticore. I cracked it open. The files within were a testament to Thorne's treachery. He was the head of a shadow network within the FBI, a cancer that had been growing for years, with ties to a domestic extremist group that Janus had been trying to dismantle. He was the one who had orchestrated everything, but as I scrolled through the logistical authorizations, the equipment transfers, the budget approvals for the deep fake rendering servers, I saw the true, horrifying depth of the betrayal. Every single request, every piece of the puzzle that had been used to build my coffin had been signed off on, approved, and expedited by one person. The digital signature was clean, undeniable, and it belonged to Director Theron Vance. It all became sickeningly clear. My father, in his arrogant pride, in his fear of looking weak or incompetent, had been played. Thorne had buried these requests in routine daily intelligence briefings, 100-page documents that no one, not even the director, ever read completely. My father had been so blinded by his own authority that he had unwittingly armed the man who was framing his own daughter. He had handed them the gun, the bullets, and the license to kill my career. Tears welled in my eyes, hot and sharp, blurring the glowing green text on the screen. I swiped them away with the back of my hand, a furious, frustrated gesture. There was no time for grief, not now. I initiated the download of the entire Manticore file. The progress bar began to crawl across the screen, and then the door to the data vault hissed open. I spun around, my heart stopping in my chest. Kaylin Thorne stood there, a smug, triumphant smile on his face, a pistol held steady in his hand. "Game over, Nix," he said. The low hum of the servers was the only sound in the cavernous data vault. The progress bar for the Manticore file download was agonizingly slow, each percentage point a small victory. My back was to the door, every nerve ending screaming, but I couldn't look away from the screen. 98%, and 99%. Download complete. The instant the file was secure, the heavy door behind me hissed open. I spun around, my body tensing into a combat stance. Kalen Thorne stood framed in the doorway, a smug, triumphant smile plastered on his face. He held a pistol, not aimed at me, but held loosely at his side, a casual display of absolute confidence. He thought he had won. "Game over, Nix," he said, his voice dripping with condescending satisfaction. He took a step into the room, letting the door slide shut behind him. "You've been a ghost in my machine for far too long. It's time to be exorcised." He was so sure of himself, so certain he had me cornered. He had no idea he'd just walked into the real trap. "You made one mistake, Thorne," I said, my voice steady, calm. I didn't move from the terminal. He laughed, a short, ugly sound. "Oh, really? And what's that? Trusting that your own father would throw you to the wolves?" He didn't even hesitate. "No," I said, allowing a small, cold smile of my own. "Your mistake was thinking you were the hunter." I paused, letting the words hang in the cold air. "You were never the hunter, you were just the bait." His smile faltered, a flicker of confusion in his eyes. "Bait? For who? Your pathetic father? He can't even save himself." "Not for him," I replied, my voice dropping. "For everyone." And right on cue, it happened. A small, almost imperceptible click echoed through the server room. It was the sound of the internal address system being activated. From my earpiece, I heard Julian's voice, calm and clear. "We're live." When my connection to Julian had been severed upon entering the vault, it had triggered our contingency plan. He had spent the last 10 minutes not trying to reconnect, but rerouting the audio and video feeds from the data vault's own high-level security system. He wasn't just watching, he was broadcasting. Thorne's smug voice, captured by the vault's microphones, suddenly boomed from the small speaker on the wall. "Game over, Nix. You've been a ghost in my machine for far too long." The color drained from his face. He stared at the speaker in horror, then at me, the realization dawning. His own words, his own confession, were being piped directly to a secure channel. A channel being monitored by Evelyn Reed, by the heads of every major department, by the very people he was trying to impress. "That deepfake video was a work of art, wasn't it?" I continued, my voice clear and projective, speaking for our audience. "Killing those agents was a bold move. Did you enjoy giving the order?" "You can't prove anything," he snarled, but the panic was evident in his eyes. He raised his pistol, but his moment of hesitation was all I needed. I kicked the rolling chair at the terminal into his knees, sending him off balance. In the same motion, I lunged forward, not at him, but at the emergency fire suppression panel on the wall. I slammed my hand on the button. Instantly, the room was filled with a deafening roar as halon gas erupted from nozzles in the ceiling, displacing all the oxygen. Thorne choked, his shot going wild, ricocheting harmlessly off a server rack. I was already moving, holding my breath, my training allowing me to function. For minutes in an anaerobic environment, I disarmed him with 2 swift, precise strikes, my hand closing around the downloaded data drive on my belt. As he collapsed, gasping for air, I was already at the emergency exit, the Manticore file secure. The ghost was gone. The aftermath was swift. In a closed hearing held in a secure conference room deep within the Hoover building, the evidence was presented. Thorne, now in custody, had confessed to everything. The mood in the room was a mixture of grim relief and quiet fury. Then, my father, Director Theron Vance, was called to speak. He looked like he had aged a decade in a matter of days. His face was a roadmap, of grief and exhaustion. He stood before the panel, not as a director, but as a broken man. "I am guilty," he began, his voice raw, heavy with a weight that seemed to crush him. I signed the documents that armed Kaylin Thorne. My pride, my refusal to appear anything less than in complete control, blinded me. "That is my failure, and I will accept the consequences." He paused, taking a ragged breath. "But I need you to understand why." He looked around the room, his gaze finally settling on me, where I sat in the back. "I knew about Thorne's network," he confessed, his voice cracking. "I knew it was a cancer in this bureau, but it was too deep, too protected. Any direct move I made would have been buried in procedure and politics. I knew the only weapon that could cut it out, the only person with the skills and the instinct to hunt in those specific shadows, was Nyx." The room was utterly silent. "I had to destroy my daughter," he said, tears now openly streaming down his face, his voice breaking completely. "I had to destroy her to save her. I had to turn her into a ghost so she could move freely in the darkness where I could not. My public accusation, my disavowal, it was the only way to sever every chain, every official tie, to set her free to do what only she could do, to give her the one thing I never could, the freedom to fight without rules." A collective gasp went through the room. I stared at him, my mind reeling, unable to process what I was hearing. The single most cruel act of my life, the wound I thought would never heal, hadn't been an act of rejection. It had been a desperate, monstrous, and heartbreaking act of sacrifice. The storm had passed, but the silence it left behind was deafening. The world now knew the truth about Kaylin Thorne and Project Manticore. My name had been cleared, but the victory felt hollow, a ghost of a triumph, because it was overshadowed by the aftershock of my father's confession. His words echoed in my mind, a terrible, looping refrain. I had to destroy my daughter to save her. A few days later, we met, not in his grand office or my sterile holding cell, but in a neutral, empty conference room on the 3rd floor. The air was still and heavy. There were no titles between us now, not director and agent, just a father and a daughter, separated by a chasm of secrets and pain. He looked smaller, diminished by the weight of his choices. The formidable presence that had once filled every room he entered was gone, replaced by a weary fragility. "I'm not asking for your forgiveness, Raisa," he said, his voice a hoarse rasp. "There's no forgiving what I did. I needed you to know. In my heart, you were never the traitor." I looked at the man who had built me and broken me in equal measure. I saw the cold, ruthless logic of his plan, a brutal piece of Cold War calculus that only a spy master of his generation could conceive. He had sacrificed his queen to win the game. I was the queen. I understood the strategy, but understanding didn't erase the scars. It didn't warm the cold spot in my soul where a father's love was supposed to be. "I know," I said, and it was the only truth I could offer him. It was not forgiveness. It was not condemnation. It was a painful, quiet acceptance of a devastating truth. His love was as complex, as dangerous, and as damaging as his work. We sat in silence for a few moments longer, two strangers bound by the same last name, before I stood up and walked away. The next day I was summoned to the director's office. Evelyn Reed sat behind the great mahogany desk, the Washington Monument framed perfectly in the window behind her, like a symbol of her newfound power. She was now acting director, and she wore the title like a bespoke suit. "Raisa," she said, her smile wide and brilliant, "you are a hero. The Bureau, this country, owes you a debt of gratitude." Her voice was filled with polished admiration. She gestured to the chair opposite her. The Janus Initiative is being reinstated with full funding and expanded operational parameters, and I want you to lead it. She slid a thick, leather-bound portfolio across the desk. It had my name on it. Inside was a new future, a chance to reclaim everything I had lost and more. It was the ultimate prize. But as I looked into her eyes, past the flawless mask of a supportive mentor, I saw it. For the first time, I saw the truth hiding in their depths. It was a cold, calculating glint, a flicker of triumph that had nothing to do with justice. And suddenly, all the pieces clicked into place. The glitch that had allowed me to see Thorne's cloned keycard, the unfortunate security incident in my holding cell, the 5-minute window she had given me to escape. It hadn't been luck. It hadn't been help. It had been stage management. She hadn't been my protector. She had been my handler. Why? I asked, the question simple, direct. Why did you help me? Reed's smile never faltered. Because Thorne was a rabid dog, Raisa, a threat to the stability of this institution. And you, she said, leaning forward with a conspiratorial warmth, you were the perfect weapon to put him down. Then her smile vanished. It didn't fade. It was extinguished, leaving her face a cold, blank slate. But now, she said, her voice dropping to an icy whisper, the weapon has served its purpose. Her hand moved beneath the desk. I heard a soft click, followed by the heavy metallic thud of the office door's magnetic lock engaging. A faint hiss, almost imperceptible, started from the air vents. A colorless, odorless gas. My blood ran cold. Your father had a good plan, Reed said, rising from her chair, her voice as cold and sterile as the room I'd been held in. A very dramatic, very emotional plan. But my plan is better. She walked around the desk, her eyes devoid of any emotion at all. He wanted to save you. I just want to clear the board. The horrifying truth hit me with the force of a physical blow. I had just escaped one prison, only to walk willingly into a far deadlier one. The air was already growing thin, the edges of my vision starting to blur. My protector had been the puppet master all along, and she had just cut my strings. The hiss was the only warning I got, a faint, almost imperceptible sound from the air vents, followed by the scent of bitter almonds. My training screamed cyanide derivative, my lungs seized, the edges of my vision began to swim. Reed's trap was brutally efficient. In 60 seconds, I'd be unconscious. In 3 minutes, I'd be dead. But Nyx doesn't die in a cage. My survival instinct overrode the panic. I held the last breath in my lungs, my mind a whirlwind of calculations. The windows, they were thick, reinforced, bullet-resistant. But they weren't unbreakable. Ignoring Reed, I grabbed the heavy, ergonomic office chair she had offered me. With a guttural roar, I heaved it with all my strength, aiming for the corner of the massive window where the glass was weakest. The first impact sent spiderweb cracks across the surface. The second shattered it. A blast of cold, damp DC air rushed into the office, a life-giving vortex that blew the toxic gas back and away from me. I gasped, sucking in the precious, clean oxygen. Reed, momentarily stunned, recovered quickly. She pulled a compact pistol from a holster concealed in the small of her back. You should have died quietly, Raisa, she snarled. But I was already moving. She was a politician. I was a predator. She fired, but I had already dived low, rolling behind the massive mahogany desk. Her shot went high, shattering a framed photo on the wall. I came up on the other side, the thick, leather-bound portfolio she had given me now in my hand. I threw it hard, like a discus, aiming for her face. It struck her on the side of the head, not enough to injure, but enough to disorient her for a crucial half-second. That was all I needed. I closed the distance between us. She tried to bring the gun around, but I was already inside her guard. The fight was short, brutal, and silent. It wasn't a brawl, it was a disassembly. A wrist lock that sent her pistol clattering to the floor. A precise strike to the brachial plexus in her shoulder, making her arm go numb. Another to the side of her knee, buckling her leg. She collapsed to the floor, gasping, her face a mask of disbelief. She had played a game of chess, only to find out her opponent preferred a knife fight. As I stood over her, breathing heavily, the locked office door burst open. Julian rushed in, followed by a tactical team in full gear, their weapons raised. Julian's eyes met mine, wide with relief. Behind them, I saw my father. He didn't enter the room, just stood at the threshold, his face a torrent of conflicting emotions. He had anticipated Reed's final move. He had sent help. The game finally was over. 6 months later, the dust had settled. Evelyn Reed's trial was a media sensation, a spectacular fall from grace. The complex tragic legacy of Theron Vance was reevaluated, and he quietly retired, disappearing from public life. And I was fully, completely, and publicly exonerated. The Bureau, in a grand gesture of reconciliation, offered me the world. I stood once more in the director's office, Reed's old office. The offer was on the table, full command of the newly reinstated and funded Janus Initiative. It was everything I had ever worked for. The power, the resources, the authority to operate in the shadows I knew so well. I looked out the window at the Washington Monument, piercing the sky, a stark white needle of power. I could have it all, but I no longer wanted it. I had spent a lifetime in the shadows, playing games where the currency was secrets and the price was pieces of your soul. I was done. I can't, I said to Julian, who stood beside me. My mission is in the light now. He simply nodded, a sad, knowing smile on his face. He understood. I was tired of breaking things. I wanted to build something. My new office wasn't in the cold, imposing fortress of the Hoover Building. It was in a charming, slightly crooked, old brick building in Georgetown, with real windows that opened and floors that creaked. I used my back pay and a quiet investment from Julian to establish a nonprofit foundation, the Legacy of Ashes Fund. Our mission was simple. We provided pro bono legal counsel and psychological support to federal agents and intelligence officers who had been wronged by the very systems they had sworn to protect. We were a safe house for the betrayed, a voice for the silenced. My legacy would not be the secret operations I had run or the enemies I had neutralized. It would be the lives I helped put back together. I was no longer Nix, the ghost of the FBI. I was Raissa Boone, a survivor who had walked out of the fire, not for revenge, but to build a sanctuary from the embers. Sometimes, in the quiet of the evening, I think of that famous speech by Theodore Roosevelt, the one Julian had me read so long ago. The credit belongs not to the critic, but to the man who is actually in the arena, whose face is marred by dust and sweat and blood. I had been in the arena. My face had been marred. I had fought, I had bled, and I had been broken. But I had endured. I looked at the wall in my new office, covered not with mission targets, but with the photos of the people we were helping. A young analyst from the NSA, a seasoned DEA agent, a rookie from the Secret Service. Their faces, once filled with despair, now held a glimmer of hope. And for the first time in a life defined by conflict and shadows, I felt a profound, unshakable sense of peace. I had finally won. My story began with a betrayal that nearly erased me, but it ended with a truth I built for myself. You are the only one who can define your own legacy. Many of us have been in our own arenas, fighting battles that no one else can see. The greatest victory isn't just surviving the fight, but choosing how you live after it's over. If this story resonated with the fighter in you, share it with someone who needs to hear that it's possible to rebuild from the ashes. For more stories about overcoming the impossible and finding your own light, subscribe and become part of our community. You are not alone.